the executive director of the APA Foundation, as well as a board member of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. And it is my privilege to welcome you to this conversation in the People's Living Room for Juneteenth 2023. Our focus tonight, the legacy of Brown versus the Board of Education at its 69th anniversary and the future of civil and human rights inside and outside the classroom. We know from the news clips that we've seen and on and offline that the state of our public and private education systems are under siege. We are banning books. We are imposing zero discipline. We are mandating test taken over learning. We are putting our teachers in an impossible position to do more with less when we should be funding more to get more, not only for today's but future generations. 69 years ago, when Brown versus Board was decided, although it was a unanimous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, many people don't realize that it was one of the most heavily litigated lawsuits in the United States history, both at the trial court level, at the appellate court level, all the way to the Supreme Court, where many believed that separate but equal had been the law of the land. It was serving its purpose and it had no need for change. Fortunately, the Supreme Court saw wisdom through the legal genius of Justice Thurgood Marshall, then a lawyer, and his legal team, to basically state that separate but equal was both unfair and unconstitutional. And once the floodgates of that decision were opened, there was a backlash. And so even as opportunity had been made available, there was a reaction that was visceral and violent, that if you want to make us go to school with people who don't look like us, who don't live in neighborhoods where we send our children to school, then either we're going to make it impossible for them to make it to the schoolyard, or we're just going to close schools altogether and we just won't have school. So we don't want anybody to believe at 69 years that this has been a straightforward path. But we also want to make sure that people understand that as we speak tonight, the Supreme Court of the United States is 2 weeks away from closing its term, and affirmative action is on the docket. And we are expecting at any day a decision from the Supreme Court about the future of affirmative action. We don't know what the decision is going to be, but the questions weren't flattering in terms of understanding why the benefits of affirmative action benefit not only the United States of America, but the world writ large. Tonight, we are joined by three very distinguished panelists in three very different disciplines from three very different locations who are going to bring their time, their talent, and their expertise to the future of education from a political lens, from a policy lens, from an academic lens, and from a psychological and psychiatric lens of what it means to know that people are this interested in you that they don't care that you went through it, but we're not going to teach anybody about what you went through. So we're going to whitewash what the history is so that you can't really understand where you came from. And that way you'll never get where you think you need to go. So we're joined tonight by the Honorable Retta A. Bowers of the Texas State Legislature, House District 113, which is a part of Dallas. She'll tell you a little bit about her background in her opening statement. But Rep. Bowers is a former educator and media personality in Texas. And so she's been at the epicenter of these issues in the legislature in Texas over the last couple of sessions. She's come into national prominence because she brought the first Texas Girls in STEM Day in March of every year. And then this year, she was able to, after multiple years' fight, make the Crown Act a reality in the state of Texas. And the bill was signed, I believe, Monday of this week. And so, Rep. Bowers, welcome to the People's Living Room at the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. Then we have Dr. Michael Fontroy. Dr. Fontroy, I see Dr. Chavis has joined, and we'll come to him in a moment. Dr. Michael Fontroy is the Associate Professor of Policy and Government and the founding director of Race, Politics, and Policy at the George Mason University in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's held many posts in research and analytics around race and policy, including being the acting director of the Ron Walters Leadership Institute at the Howard University. He was an analyst at the Congressional Research Service, and he also worked at the U.S. Civil Commission on Civil Rights, and had a defining book back in 2007 on Republicans and the Black vote, which I commit to all of your attention if you haven't had a chance to read that book. He's widely published and commented on. So for those of you who read the Washington Post, the Times, the New York Daily News, Newsday, USA Today, New York Post, and so forth, it's not uncommon to see Dr. Michael Fauntleroy commenting. And I have no doubt, being an academician at university, that he has some thoughts about the future of education and the legacy of Brown versus Board. Then we want to turn to the Regina James, MD, a physician psychiatrist. She is the Deputy Medical Director of the American Psychiatric Association and the Chief of Diversity and Health Equity at APA, which is the oldest continuously operating medical society in the United States. It's actually 2 years older than the American Medical Association. And Dr. James has practiced and degreed in health equity, in policies and procedures around child and adolescent psychiatry. She's a double Bruin from the UCLA school, both in college and medical school, spent some time at Johns Hopkins as well as Harvard. And so she brings a lot of time and talent about what it means to endure these indignities of microaggression and imposter syndrome and burnout when it comes to the legacy of Brown versus Board at 69 and the future of education. And then last, but certainly not least, Dr. Benjamin F. Chavis Jr., an esteemed member of world renown, a member of the Wilmington 10, the chair of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust Board, former NAACP CEO, among others, a minister of the cloth, but also somebody who's been putting it on the front lines since the 60s of trying to make sure that we get the least of these get more than their portion because they've been denied it for so many years. So let me welcome my entire panel. And before we actually get into the bread and butter of our Q&A, let me turn it to my board chair, Dr. Chavis, for some opening remarks. So Dr. Chavis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Attorney Andrews, and to my distinguished colleagues, members of the panel, and to all the listening audience who are listening across the United States, actually throughout the world via the internet. On behalf of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust, I join Attorney Andrews, welcome you to tonight's program. Um, the name of our facilities, the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. We uphold, we salute, and we want to do everything that we can in real time, not only to keep the legacy of Thurgood Marshall alive and well and expanding across America and throughout the world, but we all should always revisit what happened with the Brown decision 69 years ago, the consequences. I was born in 1948 in a little small town in Oxford, North Carolina, segregated school system. So in 1954, when that tremendous decision was made at Brown versus the Board of Education, it was just a tremendous uplift for those of us in the segregated South, as well as, I'd say, the North, the West, and all parts of the country were affected. So today, there's still a lot of disparities in education. Today, there's still a lot of discrimination. Today, there's even some who are trying to um, resegregate, but also to ban books, ban history, ban science. It's a challenging time to talk about the legacy of Thurgood Marshall. But the good news is there's more than millions and millions of people, particularly young Generation Z and millennials, who are thirsty and hungry for the truth, I'm so pleased that the greatest program we have currently now at the Thurgood Marshall Center, and I end on this point, Brother Andrews, is our youth student program, where we've identified and encouraged young people across the city in the public school system and around the country through the STEM's Honor Society, seeing so many young, talented scholars. I'm talking about in the junior high schools, in the high schools, public schools, K through 12, who want to go on to HBCU or to other colleges to make a difference. So I'm a strong defender and supporter of our young people. I think the youth today is the best group of young people who've been blessed to witness, but they need encouragement because there's so much weight on young people today, particularly in the African American community and other communities of color. So this seminar, this panel tonight, Brother Andrews, thank you for putting it together. And again, thank our fellow panelists on behalf of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. And I also bring you greetings on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, representing the Black Press of America, we are headquartered in the Thurgood Marshall Center. And I'm pleased to have had the opportunity and the privilege to be chair of the board. So welcome and God bless the success of tonight's program.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chavis, and thank you for all the work that you've done and you continue to do to ensure that equality and equity find a way to places where we live, learn, work, worship, and play. Now, what I'd like to do is ask Representative Bowers to come forward with an opening statement. Welcome again, Representative Bowers. We know you down in the Lone Star state of Texas. That's the front lines when it comes to civil and human rights these days. Please share with us some opening thoughts tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Attorney Andrews and Chairman Chavis and all of those watching. I want to thank the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust for having me tonight and for the invitation. I am Texas State Representative Retta Andrews Bowers, and I represent House District 113. I am happy, as I said, to be with you this evening to discuss such a serious issue. And again, thank you to Attorney Andrews and Chairman Chavis. Brown versus the Board of Education is simply one of the most important, influential, and greatest rulings ever delivered by the Supreme Court. You've heard a little bit about it and know about it. It indicated a true shift towards equality while the civil rights movement struggled to end the Jim Crow era. The integration of schools represented a generational shift, creating more opportunity for entire swaths of the nation. But even with all that said, public schools still remain on the front line for equality and civil rights. Several states, unfortunately, my state of Texas is included, have worked to undermine our public schools. Whether they are banning books, which we've been fighting hard against from our libraries, and we saw that again in the 88th legislative session just ending a month ago, whitewashing history or defunding our schools by creating private school vouchers. And we may have to go back to fight that in the near future with the special session. There's a serious conservative onslaught against our teachers, our school boards, with takeovers here in the state of Texas, in Houston ISD, and in Harris County, and our classrooms. I have been on the Texas House floor defending against these very assaults. I've heard all of the buzzwords that have blown up into major parts of modern discourse, like we've talked about already, and we'll talk about further, CRT, DEI, and ESAs. But people need to realize these aren't just rhetorical discussions. When states take these actions, they are materially affecting hundreds and thousands of lives for the worse. And so while the fact remains that Brown versus Board is a law of the land, we also need to understand, as we will be discussing tonight, that there have been forces that have wanted to chisel away at the progress ever since. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion with my fellow panelists tonight, and I hope that everyone watching from home will be able to take some lessons to heart about where the state of education stands today. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Bowers, and we look forward to your insights tonight. Now I'd like to turn to an opening statement from Dr. Michael Fauntleroy, Dr. Fauntleroy of George Mason University in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Dr. Fauntleroy.
Thank you very much, Brother Andrews. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this conversation, which I think is very timely and very necessary, given, as you noted, the impending decision from the U.S. Supreme Court that may well turn back the clock even more so on very important issues regarding education. So I'm coming to you today as a public school graduate here in Washington, D.C., the city of my birth. I'm also coming to you from the perspective of a college professor who has taught at public schools and private schools, large schools and small schools, HBCUs and PWIs. And I have a very particular concern about the impact that current trends will have potentially on higher education. I'm looking forward to getting into that a little later. But I am a political scientist. That's sort of my perspective. And so as the mathematician sees the world through numbers and angles, and the entrepreneur sees the world through profits and losses, and the litigator may see the world through law and contracts, I see the world through politics and public policy. And I really do think that right now may well be among the most perilous times that many of us have seen, certainly over the course of the last 50 years, if not more. And I'm deeply concerned about this, because I do think that so much progress that has been brought forth over the course of the last 50 years or last 60 years or so is significantly threatened. And so I'm really happy to be here, in part because I really think what we're doing tonight and the kind of conversation we're trying to spark is very much in line with a line from a Methodist hymn that I find very inspirational and guiding. And that is to not be afraid to defend the weak because of the anger of the strong, and to not be afraid to defend the poor because of the anger of the rich. What we see right now taking place in the country, not just in pockets of the country, but in the country writ large, in some respects is a backlash to progress and an angry reaction from those in positions of strength and positions in wealth. And so I look forward to this conversation and being as useful as I can, and really think that what we're doing here is going to be very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fauntleroy. And now let's get a medical perspective. I want to bring forward Dr. Regina James, because a lot of times when we're talking about law and policy, we dehumanize those students, those parents, those educators who have to live through all of these cases and these debates in whatever room those debates are happening, on or offline. So Dr. Regina James, would you please share with us some of your opening insights on tonight's program?
So thank you, Mr. Andrews, and thank you to the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust for inviting me to participate in this important panel discussion. First of all, just the topic of the legacy of Brown versus Board of Ed Supreme Court ruling. Obviously, as you know, there have been multiple positive outcomes of integrating schools, and there have been studies that have been done to really support this. You know, there's more parental involvement. People are graduating, particularly Black young folks are graduating at higher rates. They're doing better in terms of getting jobs, less poverty. So there's definitely some positive aspects to integration and what has happened as a result of the Brown versus Board of Ed decision. But we would be remiss if we did not also keep in our minds some of the unintended consequences of integrating people of color into environments where they may not be necessarily the majority. So thinking about things when students may actually face issues around discrimination, when they may face issues around microaggressions. And as you know, as a psychiatrist, I have to give credit to Dr. Chester Pierce, a psychiatrist who really came up and coined the term microaggressions. And although the term is really microaggressions, it actually has major impacts on someone's well-being and psychological state. And again, there's strong support that microaggressions are correlated with poor mental health outcomes. So we have to think about sort of the psychological impact of what happens when you integrate Black students, people of color in general, in a larger population where they are not the majority. So thinking about and making sure that we are paying attention to some of the psychological issues, like them facing discrimination, them facing microaggressions, imposter syndrome, being in an environment, and I'm sure that at some point we may have experienced this, or someone that we know very closely has experienced it. Not because we don't have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to actually perform the duties, but because you may have received statements or you may have received hints or micro insults that allow you to begin to question your own abilities. And that too has an impact on one's psychological well-being. So what I'd like to do during our discussion this evening is make sure that we weave into the discussion and make sure that we pay attention to not only the political and economic issues that surround integration and the result of Brown versus Board of Ed, but also think about the psychological consequences of the students who are actually in schools and what type of impact that's having on them. So I can get much deeper into that as we have discussions. But again, very honored to be a part of this panel and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Dr. James. One of the things we need to do now that we've had these opening statements is sort of ground ourselves in the Brown versus Board decision and its aftermath. And what a lot of people don't know is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was supposed to be in Wilmington, North Carolina on April 4th, 1968. What we all know is that he stayed over in Memphis and was assassinated. Dr. Chavis, if you would come in and just talk to us a little bit about the Wilmington 10 and what you were trying to do, because the reality of it is Brown 1 and Brown 2 had already been decided,
Yes.
but we hadn't achieved desegregation.
And thank you, Brother Andrews. And just let me thank you. And again, each of the panelists, I thought the opening statements were great. And I was just sitting here thinking to myself, each of these statements from these different disciplines all intersect in the reality of what people of color, but particularly African Americans, are facing right now in America. And so I will get into the Wilmington 10 as a lens, per se, Brother Andrew, so further explicate the issues that we have before us tonight. And I'll try to do it very succinctly. Even though the Brown decision was made in 1954, it took almost more than 2 decades for many of the school districts in the South to actually desegregate. And I would like to make a distinction between integration and desegregation. Integration, just from a mathematical perspective and also from a public policy perspective, was supposed to be not just Black people going into white schools. It was supposed to be an exchange where whites would go into formerly all Black institutions and Blacks would go into formerly all white institutions. But we know that that's not what happened. But what happened was, even though the Supreme Court, the highest court in America, had made this decision in 1954, there was resistance. Just like right now, we're living in a period of response and resistance to having a Black man in the White House for 8 years. That's how Donald Trump got elected. Because during those 8 years, there was a boiling, if you will, of sentiment of white supremacy, of anti-Blackness and And of course, people could not believe that he won the election in 2016, but that happened. And now there's almost whether or not he's indicted or whether or not he's in jail, he's still going to be the leading candidate, it looks like, to run for president again. So what does that have to do with Wilmington, North Carolina in 1971? Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, April 4th. 3 years later, let me back up. At the time Dr. King was assassinated, I was a young student youth coordinator for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization. I was one of the people. He was going to visit Wilmington and Charlotte because we had a sanitation strike also in Charlotte from ASME, the American Federation of State, County Municipal Employees, during that same time in Memphis. But obviously he was assassinated. So those of us who were still left in SCLC, we decided, well, what are we going to do to keep pushing for real school integration, real empowerment? Because by 1968, we've gotten the Civil Rights Bill of 64, the Voting Rights Bill of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68, which incidentally were passed Congress because of bipartisanship. So 3 years after Dr. King was killed, I found myself in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the last school district, public school district to quote unquote desegregate. And they only desegregated because of court order. The NAACP had filed suit. And so there was resistance to this local school board implementing the court order. And the way they implemented it, they did dismantle most of the historically black institutions and had black kids go to predominant white schools, and they ran into violent reprisals. That's why my church, the United Church of Christ, sent me to Wilmington. I'm still 20 years old at the time. I was working in Wilmington. These paramilitary white supremacist group called the ROWP attacked us in the church because we were organized and demanding that black children be treated fairly, be treated equitably in the newly desegregated school system. And because we promoted fairness and the civil rights and even the human rights of the black community at that time, we were the targets of racial violence. Keep in mind, Nixon is president now, who ran on a law and order campaign. So there's also this intersection between civil rights, public policy, microaggressions, and I would say not only microaggressions, I would say mega aggressions against our people. And there was one young man I want to point out that was in junior high school in Wilmington in 1971. His name is Michael Jordan. He was one of the young young basketball players for Wilmington, North Carolina, that we wanted to make sure got a good secondary education so he could have the opportunity to go to a place like UNC in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And then, of course, to the Chicago Bulls, and the rest is history. So because we dared to stand up, I and 9 other people, 8 of whom were only 16 and 17, 18-year-old high school students, black high school students, the 10 of us were unjustly incarcerated, unjustly imprisoned, and unjustly sentenced to 282 years in prison. So if you think about all the time that's been given, or the little time that's been given out because of what happened on January the 6th, imagine in 1971, 10 of us, young civil rights workers, given a total of 282 years in prison because we are demanding equal treatment in education for young black kids 20 years after Dr. King, after the Brown decision by Thurgood Marshall before the Supreme Court. So most of the 1970s I spent in prison as a member of the Wilmington 10, and we finally got our convictions overturned in 1980. Even though our convictions were overturned, we still had the cloud over our heads of not, because we were still convicted felons, even though it was turned over, the state has a right to re-prosecute you. So we didn't get our names cleared to 2012. So from 1971 to 2012, the Wilmington 10 had to struggle, and finally, the first female governor in North Carolina gave us a pardon of innocence. So what has happened now? If I go back to Wilmington, or go back to North Carolina, Charlotte, or Raleigh, or Durham, you find that the schools are resegregating. You find that there's been an increase in private education versus public education. There's a debate now about even the value of public education. And of course, there's this triage. So I think that we have to be very careful of these state legislatures. Our sister from Texas knows it's just not in Texas. It's Alabama, it's Georgia, it's the Carolinas, even Virginia. There's a struggle around the place of the public schools in terms of funding and in terms of access. Because look what has happened over the last 69 years, the browning of America. So you would think with the demographic changes, there would be less racism, less microaggressions, and certainly less mega aggressions, but in fact more because of the fear of the demographic changes in terms of all these states. And that's why now, even though we have a Democratic president, most of the state legislatures today across the country, these are red states. And they're doing things at the state level to ban books, to ban curriculum, they debate about critical race theory. All these things are connected. So that's the timeliness of this discussion, Brother Andrews, and our fellow panelists. I'm sorry if I went too long, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a relevance because young people today, sometimes in many places, even in the nation's capital, our young people need to be encouraged to excel in school. They need to be encouraged. The third grade reading test in many states, and particularly in New York, is used, the failure of the third grade reading test is used to determine the number of juvenile institutions, juvenile prisons that are going to be built. And so this whole public school to prison pipeline is something that we need to look at in terms of assessing the legacy of Thurgood Marshall, assessing the aftermath of Brown versus the Board of Education in 2023 context.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. We're going to bring our panel in. A powerful word. We can't say thank you enough for what you did to get us to this point, but we know that the fight is not over. Rep Bowers, a word on reflections about Dr. Chavis' remarks before we move forward.
Well, thank you, Dr. Chavis, for your comments and opening remarks. It certainly is what we've been experiencing in Texas. And you talk about the browning of America and turning us into majority minority society. And that is certainly what's happening, whether that's talking about CRT, 2 sessions of that, DEI certainly was on the table this last regular legislative session in the 88th. And many programs here in Texas were cut when it came to higher ed, and we looked at tenure in higher ed. DEI cut altogether, and many people have lost jobs. And the fight was terribly difficult for us on the floor because, as you said, we don't like to call them red states. We like to call them non-voting states, but we certainly are a real, true super minority. We do everything we can to kill those bad bills, all the things that you mentioned. But it is really tough for us. And like you said, it is all across the nation. We watch Florida, we watch Georgia, and many other southern states that are fighting the same things. I didn't mention book bans. I think you already talked about that. But, I spent some time last fall in Israel. And when you look at the Holocaust and genocide, it certainly does feel like we are at the beginnings of and there you go with the browning of America, of beginnings of what they experienced. It felt like to me, visiting the Holocaust Museum there, that we were listening to our own story. Black legislative women, a group of 20 of us, first time that 20 Black female legislators visited Israel and Jerusalem. And we were very much disrespected as not only legislators, Black female, vocal females in a country, where women still aren't largely respected. So it felt like they were telling us our own story, and we could look at what it might look like after the book bans and certainly privatizing education. So thank you for your opening remarks and all that you all did in the Wilmington 10, to fight this in the very beginning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Bowers. Dr. James, health and wellness and the future of education. Could you reflect on Dr. Chavis and Rep. Bowers' remarks and talk about how you see health and wellness being a part of the future of a better state of education?
Well, let me just say, first of all, Dr. Chavis, thank you for your remarks. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about one of the statements that you made in terms of the browning of society, yet there's this fear of this demographic change and how that's really impacting schools and racism and discrimination. And it also made me think about as well, sort of, yes, we have a more diverse sort of population in society, but because of, and I'm sure maybe Dr. Fontward will speak about this from a political and policy standpoint, but because of some of the policies that have been implemented, like redlining, you have more diversity, yes, but you also have more Black and brown people sort of concentrated in certain areas. So there are more, but they are more concentrated in areas where there is less resources, where there is more poverty and things of that nature. So that too, the schools now, from what I've read, are actually, there's more integration, but yet there's still more segregation in terms of, Black and brown, and essentially people of color being in school systems where the resources are low, where the taxes are lower in terms of paid by the folks in the neighborhood. So again, even though you have this integration, it isn't necessarily addressing the issues of resources, because you have this sort of backdoor policy that's really still helping drive these inequities and inequalities. And so I was just kind of thinking about that as you were speaking about the fear of the demographic change. I don't know if it's fear, because policies were definitely put in place to address these demographic changes and still allowed sort of this pockets of poverty and pockets of Black and brown people who still, in a sense, are not getting the adequate resources for education. So just wanted to point that out. And Mr. Andrews, you asked me to speak about health and wellness as it relates to education.
Yes, Doc.
So obviously that's very important. As I mentioned in my opening statement, as you know, there is a crisis with our young people, particularly around mood issues, particularly around depression, and being exposed to discrimination, being exposed to racism, not being in an environment where you have teachers and those who are in charge really encouraging you and really highlighting the positives of your diversity can actually have obviously a significant impact on one's psychological well-being. And as you know, there truly is a crisis with our young people today in terms of mental health. I'm sure you're aware of the report that was written by the Congressional Black Caucus, Ring the Bell, which is really bringing up the fact that, a lot of our young people, Black people, are really, dying from suicide. And I think there was a paper recently published in the Journal of Pediatrics just this year that essentially says now that suicide is the leading cause of death of young people. So when you think about sort of psychological well-being, when you think about sort of behavioral issues that we're dealing with, again, there's these policy issues, there's these economic issues, but we definitely have to pay attention to the psychological well-being of our young people. And it is truly a crisis. So as we're fighting these battles, we're also fighting these side battles where we really have to, keep our young people alive because of what's going on in society, because of what we're all experiencing, because of what happened with COVID. People were more isolated, kids were more isolated. So this issue around psychological well-being, as we talk about 69 years post Brown versus Board of Ed, I just want to, really underscore the importance of please let us not forget the psychological well-being, what some of these kids experience, what they have to go through, and really having a lot of unmet mental health needs. Even though they have these issues, they don't really have an opportunity to have those issues treated. And even in schools, when they do have these mental health issues, they're actually looked at as bad kids or bad behavior. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, somehow they get shifted to more suspensions, down to the pipeline of going to prison. So there are a lot of underlying psychological issues that we truly need to pay attention to, so that we don't get distracted by some of these other issues, to make sure that if we deal with the root of the issues of what's going on with the students, that we have a better chance for their success.
Thank you, Dr. James. You've taken us to school, so let's go to the schoolhouse with Dr. Michael Fontroy. We're at the schoolhouse steps, Dr. Fontroy. What is academic freedom, and how does academic freedom play a role in the work that you do at university?
Well, that's a big question to start with. It means so many things to so many people. But I definitely want to speak to that, because I think it's critical that we all understand and all sort of on the same page. Before I do that, though, I just need to also join with the other panelists regarding Dr. Chavis's comments. Because as you all know, you all have participated in zillions of these kinds of events. You understand that context is really key to understanding, right? And if we don't understand the history behind why certain things wash out the way they do, then it's really more difficult to understand how you move forward. And so as the son of a woman who grew up in Burlington, North Carolina, I'm always interested in hearing what went on in Wilmington. So thank you for that, Dr. Chavis.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so at the schoolhouse, and in my case, a higher education schoolhouse, a university, academic freedom means the ability to be able to rely on your expertise to teach things the way they are, not necessarily the way some people want them to be. I'm a big believer in a 360-degree view of history, religion, literature, whatever the topic matter may be. But we now are entering into a view in which, a period in which we really can't get to a 360-degree view of our shared history, whether it's in politics, policy, English, science, whatever the topic may be, because we have to fight first with people who don't want to acknowledge our history. And so we're spending so much time just sort of trying to stiff arm people who would rather literally whitewash our story, that we can't we can't really engage in the kind of academic freedom that we want. And I will just admit to you and those of us watching that this is something that hits personally with college professors all over the country, even in places in which you may well be well situated. I have to confess that, I have censored myself in the classroom at some point over the last few years because there are things that I want to say that I think are valuable. But we live in such a hypersensitive world right now that you can't really tell all of the story the way you may want, because somebody's going to go run to the dean, and then you got to go deal with all of that. So we don't have a point we're not at a point right now where we can have a 360-degree educational experience, particularly when we consider books are being banned, and some of the same books that can help tell the full 360-degree story of America. Curricula are being politicized all over the place, where the critical race theory is being purposely misshapen. There are other parts of our story that are being purposely misshapen because they make certain people feel a certain way about their part in this history or their ancestors' part in this history. And then we have a real anti-intellectual bent right now, where the idea of a deep intellectual experience and understanding of certain issues is not well taken right now, because the quick and dirty, the sort of soundbite era in which we now live doesn't really allow for that. So academic freedom is actually part of the larger story of pushback against education at all levels in the United States, and that what those who are pushing back against it really are saying is, I want academic freedom for me to say what I want to be able to say, but I don't want academic freedom for you, because academic freedom for you is going to run counter to this narrative that I want to get out. And so I'm deeply worried about academic freedom. I am working in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which, for more sort of contextual information, everybody should know that in the massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, there was a county, Prince Edward County in Virginia, that literally closed their public schools for a full year rather than comply with the requirements of Brown. And that funding was used to open up or literally provide vouchers for white kids to go to private schools and continue their education, where Black kids were literally left by the side of the road. And the academic intellectual impact of a lost year of learning was, for some, life-changing. And so here we are in a Commonwealth that has a deep and rich history in education. The College of William and Mary is the second oldest university in the United States. And of course, we know the University of Virginia is a tent pole in American higher education. But at the same time, we're also in a place in which there appears to be a brewing storm to push back against DEI in public institutions across the Commonwealth. And so I just think it's important for everybody to understand that these concepts like academic freedom are not just simply buzzwords. They really do lie at the core of education. And so if you can't teach in high school, for example, about the Trail of Tears or Japanese internment, or give a real and serious discussion about slavery, then not only are the kids who derive from those groups not respected in terms of their story, as Representative Bowers noted earlier with her trip to Israel, but white kids are also damaged by that. All right, they are not getting the full education that they deserve also. And so I just want everybody to know that we do have some significant work to do to tell the truth about these efforts to water down and undermine educational opportunity in the United States, throughout the country. Some states are far worse than others. We understand that, and we need to tell the truth about that. But we also need to understand that it's really insidious in that the lack of education on some of these items makes it much easier to act like these things didn't happen and that they aren't important and we can just move on because, it makes some people uncomfortable.
Thank you, Dr. Fauntroy. Dr. Chavis, reflections on remarks by Dr. Fauntroy.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fauntroy and Dr. Browse and Representative Browse and Dr. James. I think that this has been a real great discussion, and I know all the listeners are benefiting from it. To me, Brother Andrews, you open the door now, not only for us to have this panel discussion, but I'm thinking about the after flow. After this discussion, what are some of the next steps that people can do? I think that on behalf of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this program, we did not want the 69th anniversary of the Brown decision to go by without bringing note, not only historical note, but how the history applies to today. And certainly, if Thurgood Marshall could be with us today, he would be championing, making sure that Brown is not overturned. Because I'm concerned right now that the current Supreme Court has given some indications after they overturned Roe versus Wade. Even Clarence Thomas was intimating that it's time to overturn Brown. So I think that we have to stay vigilant. We have to stay persistent. And I really believe that we have to challenge every aspect of higher education. I like what Dr. Fauntroy said about 360 degrees of education. It seems to me it's not only pre-K through 12, but undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, all aspects. It's interesting that one of the tenets of white supremacy is really ignorance. And we seem to be not just dumbing down, but it seems to be a glorification of what's called alternative facts. There's no such thing as an alternative fact. If it's not a fact, then it's not a fact. And I think that there's an anti-science syndrome where we deny the reality of climate, we deny the reality of environment, and how that also impinges on the quality of life of the communities in which we serve. So my comment, Brother Andrews, is that, look, we got work to do. We got to keep our sleeves rolled up. We got to work at these state legislative levels. We got to work in the professional level in all the professions, and particularly in medicine. I'm sure all of you just heard this tragedy of our beloved Olympic sister passing away in childbirth. And this whole thing about discrimination of Black women in terms of just public health. This is serious. To me, our struggle for freedom, justice, equality, and equity, Brother Andrew, this is a life and death struggle. This is not something a lightweight concern or a sidebar concern. This goes to the very heart and essence, not only of who we are as a people, but who humanity. What is humanity in 2023? And our country ought to be, that is the United States of America. We should be a citadel of democracy, but yet we have now indications that some people feel that they're above the law. The rule of law doesn't apply to them, or that, and this is from the very top. So I think that we got really work to do, and that reminds me of something that James Brown, Marvin Gaye, and Gil Scott-Heron used to remind us, that we have to be not just the soul of our people, we have to be the soul of America. We have to remind America of its travail. We have to remind America that we have made progress, no question about it, but we still have a long ways to go. But we only made the progress because we banded together. We dared to push the envelope. We dared to champion the cause of the less fortunate. And that has to be reasserted over and over and over again. So I come to this discussion tonight optimistic, not because I see everything all right, but I see the opportunity to do further change. We dare not allow the legacy of Thurgood Marshall to be extinguished by the current Supreme Court. We dare not allow these state legislators to continue to try to erode and gerrymander and change rules so that the real majority of Americans are structurally and systematically discriminated against, so that the right to vote. Every time you see these voter suppression tactics, it's because of fear that people will one day have true access to the ballot, true access, and to make our democracy strong. So to me, there's a lot at stake next year at the 2024 election. And one of the things I'm concerned about, Brother Andrews and fellow panelists, there seems to be this, through social media, this misinformation and almost getting our people to feel like, oh, well, elections, they don't count, it doesn't really make a difference. We engage in that kind of alienation to our pearl. I think that we have to be much more involved from a grassroots level, from a movement building perspective. And I believe our young people will rise to the occasion if they get the proper encouragement, the proper mentorship, the proper apprenticeship, the proper help. Not pointing fingers, but helping hands to lift up our young people.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Representative Bowers, at the outset of the program, we talked about you being a former K-12 educator before you got into the political arena. What are you seeing the difference between when you were in the classroom with our children versus what you're debating and discussing in the Pink Building in Austin, Texas?
Gosh, a lot of it, It has evolved over time, I guess, since I've been in the legislature. But when I was in the classroom, uh, of course, here in Texas, and most schools, we do not have prayer in schools. That's one thing that they're trying to infuse back into the school to be able. The governor said, Governor Abbott, the other day, that now we are allowed to say, "In God we trust," and have that displayed back in the classroom, and the 10 Commandments. So they're thinking of any way they can give things to our ISDs, our teachers, and our students, everything but funding. I think Dr. Chavis talked about it, and just increasing the privatizing of our schools instead of and decreasing public funding is really what is happening. And so they're defunding our public schools. They're pushing for vouchers. Charter schools are really moving in. That's one thing that I didn't have many of in the district before, in the House district, before I started serving at this level. But teachers here in Texas have not received a pay increase in over a decade, right along with our retired teachers who have not received a cost of living adjustment in 14 plus years. It's more than a decade. And so we've been fighting to figure out how to we look at incentivizing things to make our teachers, but the incentivizing that they're talking about deals with hardening of schools. Here in Texas and across the nation, we are in a real gun violence situation and crisis. And they're talking about arming teachers. That's one thing that I guess has changed, if you ask Mr. Andrews, since I was in the classroom. It's more about arming teachers with weapons than with giving them the wherewithal to teach. Back then they were teaching to the test. They certainly still are doing that, but we really fought a lot about hardening our schools in this last session, especially after trying to do something when it came to the Uvalde shooting that you all are aware of. I being serving on Homeland Security and Public Safety, also serving on the Speaker's Select Committee for Community Safety, certainly fought hard to raise the age when it came to people buying weapons, and they're wanting to give them to our teachers. One thing I think I have to mention is when it's the whitewashing of our history. When we look at critical race theory, this is the second session that I've had to deal with the fight against critical race theory. And I just want to say, in the last interim, you might have heard here in Texas, our Texas State Board of Education was debating whether to call slavery involuntary relocation. And I just thought that was absurd and and very insulting. That they would want to teach, and as you said, Dr. Chavis, dumb down our children. I really feel like here in Texas, it's and maybe nationwide, it is just about, like you said, not sharing with them so that they don't know. One, they can't read. I think you mentioned, Dr. Chavis, about the third grade testing and how that is just an invitation for sending them, from the classroom to prison pipeline. So it has evolved over time. When I was in the classroom, it was more about funding public education. We were fighting a $5.4 billion budget cuts of 2011 when I entered, and just trying to make sure we could keep property taxes down and give more from the state level.
Thank you, Representative Bowers. A lot to take in, Dr. James, but we want to hear from you. So if you can incorporate some of the understanding of critical race theory, wokeness or anti-wokeness, and diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging into your response, we'd appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad that we're getting into the piece about critical race theory, because I think one of the issues, well, let me just back up and start by saying, I really feel like the time that we're going through is like Reconstruction Part 2. it's sort of a backlash of, we had a Black president for 2 terms. And so people really felt like, okay, race doesn't really count and we're all equal. We know that's not true. And so now there has really been this stoking of fear with misinformation and wrong definitions. I mean, even thinking about critical race theory itself. I mean, critical race theory is essentially just one of many theories, really, to explain inequalities, right? I mean, but people have taken the critical race theory and sort of wove it into critical race theory is sort of the label, but it's also diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. It's also training. It's also, they've just sort of pulled these things all together into one glob, and then taken that misinformation and then started, saying, oh, we just can't have all of these things, making our children, being afraid and uncomfortable hearing this different narrative about history through these diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging trainings. I mean, it's just not appropriate, and we're not going to support those, and we're not going to fund those. And then they just throw in critical race theory, which really is not related to, they're not even related, but it's this misinformation. It's sort of bringing these two pieces together that is really kind of stoking fear and having some of the populations believe that, the narrative that we have been taught in terms of a lot of our history was fine and dandy, and we should just stick with that and not necessarily move into this woke session that we're in and essentially fill in the gaps of things that we never really learned about in the first place. I mean, one of the things that I think about, I was reading about, we're speaking about book banning and banning the book about Ruby Bridges, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges. Her having to go through all the name calling, derogatory names, having a marshal escort her to school. Now, she could go through all of that about Ruby Bridges because it's going to make my 6-year-old uncomfortable to read a story about a 6-year-old who really has gone through all of this stuff. I mean, it's just really ridiculous. I mean, that actually really gets my goat when I, think about these things, because it's not, first of all, critical race theory, and Dr. Fontmore, I'm sure you could go much deeper than I am, but critical race theory isn't something that's taught to K through 12 kids. That's just wrong. You know what I mean? It's a theory, again, to explain inequalities, as there are other theories to explain inequalities, like the feminist theory that explains inequality as it relates to gender. It's not something that you teach kids in K through 12. It's a theory. So, I just think we just need to clear up some of the misinformation and some of the essentially, what did you call them? Alternative facts and alternative truths, all these things that they're basically just not true. And just clear up the information, because it's really just spinning out of control, truly secondary to this fear of sort of the backlash of, the communities and the population is getting browner, and we really need to take hold and take control. So, this is how we can do it. Just put out this misinformation, put out this stuff that really isn't true, start making people become fearful, like they're losing their power, like they're losing their superiority. And then you get, all these states with these anti-DEI efforts that they throw in critical race theory, which really isn't related. But this is a really topic that kind of gets to me, as you can see. But
No, thank you, Dr. James. 35 years ago, critical race theory was a class I learned in law school, not in elementary school, high school, or and what was really interesting about critical race theory, because I'm coming to you, Dr. Fauntleroy, is what if we just taught Dred Scott? What if we just taught the entirety of the 13th Amendment, the full text of what the 13th Amendment really reads? What if we really taught Plessy versus Ferguson? Those aren't theories. That's law of the land. But for some evolution and some changes in policy, would still be. 13th Amendment has never fully been explained when we talk about the kindergarten to prison pipeline and what it means. What does it really say about being freed from the bondages of slavery? So Dr. Fauntleroy, in the academy, I know you talked a little bit about some of your challenges, but does critical race theory come up on campus, and how do you deal with it?
So the answer is yes. So I'm hesitating a bit because it's just so ironic that critical race theory was on the agenda today, and of course I teach on the presidency. This is an example of why representation matters, right? So I'm an African American man, sensitized in a particular way, focused on the political interests of Black people, but I also have a deep appreciation and interest in the American presidency and how that has guided so much of what this country is about. But in my view, you can't teach national government or the presidency or Congress or the Supreme Court and some of the other courses that you'll find in a traditional political science department or school of public policy and not deal with race. And so I sort of infuse some of that in the teaching of the American presidency. Dr. Chavis mentioned earlier Richard Nixon and the Southern Strategy. And we know Ronald Reagan's campaign launch in 1980 in at the Neshoba Fair in Mississippi, and all of these other ways in which race is literally woven into America. So this gets to the real issue for me with regard to critical race theory, and that is the people who are pushing back against it don't understand it, but they understand that they have a political issue that they could use to motivate people to go to the polls. I will be willing to bet you almost everything I own that the vast majority of the loudest voices in American politics can't give you a coherent description or definition of the concept of critical race theory. They just know, like with wokeness and defund the police, there are terms that can be used for political ends to drive and be successful in terms of getting to certain policy goals. And so, while I want a deep discussion of the things that Kimberly Crenshaw and others were introducing in law schools in America 35 years ago, right? And I know that there's no discussion of it, never has been at the elementary level. I think that unfortunately the issue has been twisted in such a way that with so many things that are going on in our public dialogue right now, our public discourse, the facts matter less than emotions, and that if we can get people riled up around emotions, then the facts won't matter. And that's critical race theory is one of the ways in which that is happening right now in the United States. You're on mute, Ron.
Rep. Bowers, you had something to do with House Bill 3435 in Texas a couple of sessions ago. Could you talk to us about why you worked on House Bill 3435 and what you're seeing in change? What was that bill all about, and how you see an evolution in Texas?
Thank you for the question, and ask about one of my premier pieces of legislation, an authentic bill that no agency or organization brought me, but it truly had to deal with Dr. James may experience this as well, but it was about gender and women in professions that certainly are mostly male oriented. And so, one, it was about closing the pay gap and exposing young girls. It's coined as Texas Girls in STEM Day. It's House Bill 3435, passed in the 86th legislative session. And Governor Abbott saw fit to sign it into law. He didn't quite give me a signing ceremony, but he certainly signed that piece of legislation, and it is a law, and it is a state holiday forever and a day. It will go on for generations and generations. We've had 4. March 1st is Texas Girls in STEM Day, and what we do is work with higher education systems. We work with Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts. Now Boy Scouts does include girls. And so we certainly work with preteens elementary age and students and exposing them to STEM fields and to the arts. That we've had two virtual, and because of COVID, and which you and your organization, Mr. Andrews, participated in one of those years, but two in person. The Girl Scouts STEM Center for Excellence here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex had us out. We had a big scavenger hunt that first inaugural year. Just Girl Scouts made a patch for our state holiday. But this year, we went back in person and brought in a group and a young entrepreneur with an organization called Black to the Lab. So we had students during spring break that we worked with our ISDs come in and do science experiments and create, like they were in the lab, make scrubs, make lip gloss, and make jewelry. We had the Perot Museum come in, and it just creates a very special day for us to expose girls to the STEM fields, but also to teach our young men to respect women in leadership. So it doesn't exclude our boys. And it always creates a great day for my staff, just to work with educators and to make sure that our students are going on to greater. But we also wanted to see that gender pay gap close. And that was a final piece of why we felt that the legislation was necessary.
Thank you, Representative Bowers. Dr. James, you're an accomplished doctor now, medical doctor, but I like to tell people that medicine was one of the original STEMs, although we don't think of it that way. Was there ever a time when you were coming up where you felt like people were trying to put blocks up against you to become an accomplished medical doctor like you are now?
Is that a rhetorical question? It's funny. I was just actually sharing with my son just this morning. We've all had those stories, right? I remember in high school, it was an all-girls school in New York, and there were 5 or 6 girls who were in the Honor Society, and they were, we were all applying to college, and what do we want to, do when we grow up? And so I said I wanted to become a doctor. And so she said, well, Regina, what about being a nurse? I was like, yeah, nurse is fine. I just don't want to do it. She goes, well, so-and-so who is also in the Honor Society, she wants to be a nurse and she's really smart. So how about that? I don't want to be a nurse. But it's just like, I don't know if she felt that she was being helpful, or was she saying, Regina, reach your fullest potential, or, reach for the stars, anything you want to do, or what, not that nurse versus doctor is on any different level, but I've always been skeptical about that statement, and it has always stuck with me. For years upon years about like, why can't I be what I want to be? Why do you want me to actually do something else? And there's always a thing as a physician when you're walking into a room. You could be the resident and you have a medical student. If the medical student happens to not be Black, more than likely the patient will look to the medical student who's not Black and say, Dr. So-and-so. Just kind of automatically, that always happens. So I just sit back. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna let Dr. So-and-so take care of you. If that this is how we're gonna have a conversation, but that happens. So there's always sort of these, I guess you can call them microaggressions that impact you and can quote unquote, make you stronger, I guess. But I am personally, and I don't know about you, Representative Bowers, I'm not very comfortable with this concept of a Black woman being resilient and being able to, withstand this, all these microaggressive statements. I don't want to be resilient. I just want to be me. So yeah, there's been many a times when you experience those types of things, and there's many stories I'm sure I can tell, as many stories everyone on here I'm sure could tell. And I would actually be interested to hear some of the statements that you've heard growing up, that what you should do instead of what you wanted to do.
So, Rep. Bowers, let's hear from you. You work in the Capitol. Not a lot of black lawmakers in the state of Texas. You ever face any challenges?
Actually, yes, and not many of us at all, not nearly enough. Let's just say that. In our Black caucus in the Texas legislature, we have 20. We have 18 in the House, and the women outnumber the men. Black females, we have 10 Black females to 3, I believe, or so. Black males, well, no, we've got 5 now. So, and then, but you look over in the Senate and we have only 2 Black senators. And certainly when I came in 2019 in the 86th legislative session, I remember, and I'm a former staffer, I'm a staffer turned member. So I did work for one of my colleagues as in her district office. And I remember, because I still do go to the Capitol Grill and get my own sandwich and get my own chicken salad or fruit salad or iced tea or whatever, what have you. And as I got ready to check out, I was a new member, and the check cashier said, "So, oh, you must be new. Who do you work for?" And I proudly said, "I work for the constituents of House District 113. I'm Representative Retta Bowers." And they still, some of the DPS officers still card me. I had this past legislative session, and certainly my sophomore and junior session, the 87th and 88th, I had DPS officers card me as I walked in. They never, of course, would card my colleagues, certainly not white male counterparts. And, I said for a second, I changed my hair, I know my hair may be different, but that is their job. That is their primary job, DPS, the Department of Public Safety, to know who we are, what we look like, and to memorize our faces. So I had someone who knew me that walked in behind me as I was being carded. I'm with my staff, and she apologized. She said, "Representative Bowers, I'm really sorry that you had to go through that." But by the time I made it to my office, Dr. James, I said, "Get DPS on the phone right now." And I've gone to the House floor. I mean, so my sophomore session, I was going between committee hearings, and DPS said, "You need to go around to the front door. You keep coming back in here every day. I see you." And I said, "Yes, every day. You see me because I am not even a freshman anymore. I am a sophomore member trying to get back to my committee hearing." It happens all the time. I can't imagine Dr. James being in those examination rooms, and they certainly don't think that you're the doctor in charge. So it is something we experience all the time, and really, Hidden Figures was a movie back then that really said this is what we are still, Hidden Figures.
Mhm.
Thank you, Representative Bowers, and we appreciate the testimonies from both you and Dr. James. And although we're not all guilty, we're all responsible, and so we do offer an apology that you have to still execute with excellence while you suffer indignity. Before we get to closing statements, though, I do want to talk a little bit about, since you brought up hair, Rep. Bowers. Every now and again, we hear these stories about our children who can't graduate because they have braids, or can't get a job, or can't get a promotion. Talk to us about, real quick, House Bill 567.
House Bill 567. It's the Texas Crown Act that we just passed this legislative session. And it's been a labor of love. 2 sessions it took to pass. But, it came in when I got the call back in 2019, when that was before DeAndre Arnold down in Barbers Hill ISD was going to be held from walking across the stage at high school graduation. Got the call and said, would I carry the Crown Act here in Texas and introduce it, but not only introduce it, but pass it. And I want to tell you, after flipping a district from red to blue, I thought that it might be really impossible. I wanted to make sure if I was going to carry it, that it was something that was happening in our own backyards. And so I spent the better part of almost 5 years talking about how it's certainly across the state of Texas and the nation. We're talking about this in our beauty salons, barbershops, and certainly people and in our classrooms, but and certainly at our kitchen tables. But people are being held from promotion. They're not getting hired. They weren't. They're in school suspension. Our students are in school suspension, saying they're a distraction in class because of the way they have groomed themselves in braids or locks. So it was a lot in the 87th. I spent a lot of time educating members. I came back this last session. House members thought we had already passed the Crown Act. I was glad of that, but I was able to get them on board. It passed the House with overwhelming support, 143 with bipartisan support, 143-5. The Senate, it came out. Senator Boris Miles in Houston carried it, was our Senate sponsor. It came out 29-1. We only have 31 senators. And certainly Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, when it passed out of the Senate and was going to the governor's desk, said, "Texas, you have been crowned." And this past Monday of this week, Governor Abbott gave us a signing. I mentioned he didn't give me one for House Bill 3435, but House Bill 567 got a bill signing ceremony. And I kept telling people that Governor Abbott needed that photo. He needed Black Texans, African Americans, to come in his reception room, to sit and with him and stand behind him on this legislation. And so now, men, women, and children in the state of Texas, we're the 21st state to pass the Crown Act. And it matches the federal bill. I was really proud of that. But this type of discrimination will be no more. And I certainly went natural again. I tried for a second time. When I came into the legislature, I was wearing a relaxer. I was fried. I wasn't dyed. I still was kind of salt and pepper, but went through COVID and certainly started to go natural again. It's been about freedom, and it's been about liberation. Had many women say they just got a new hairstyle trying to look quote unquote professional, and they stayed in their offices locked up. And I want to say lastly that I experienced some of those same microaggressions, as you said, Dr. Chavis, microaggressions that we know really are mega aggressions. And Dr. James, thank you for making sure we know the mental capacity and what that does to a person. I experienced one a real microaggression when I laid out House Bill 567 and sat through the testimony in tears, because as I laid it out in front of my colleagues in the House State Affairs Committee, they asked me since I had described what protective styles were, Bantu knots, locks, and twists, should I now have to describe what the texture of my hair is? And I sat there through tears as I listened to the testimony, and my witnesses talk about curly hair, wavy hair, and trying to, we didn't want to get into C4 and all of that, because they certainly wouldn't have understood. But it was horrible to have to even withstand the jokes of my bald colleagues. Can I wear my hair like this? Just jokes on the floor. And why is this necessary? And I certainly felt that it shouldn't be necessary. We shouldn't have to have it, but we know that it is real. It is it's discrimination, non-discrimination, civil rights legislation. And I'm proud that Texas became the 21st state, and we have now seen it signed into law. It will be enacted September 1st. And so school districts now are just trying to make sure their policies are in line, so this type of discrimination is no more.
And what better way to bring in Juneteenth in the Republic of Texas than bringing the Crown Act to law? We now rounding third base, headed for home in the people's living room of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. and we'll have some closing remarks about how we get to a better state. And we'll start with Dr. Michael Fauntleroy.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful experience for me, and so I just want to thank all of the other panelists for creating some space for me to be in this conversation. For me, education is about giving people the opportunity to go as far as their ambition and ability will take them. And it's fundamental to individual achievement and individual independence. But too often, obstacles exist for reasons that shouldn't exist, that make it more difficult for people to get an education that will allow them to go as far as their as far as their ability and ambition will take them. I am very fortunate to grow up in a city, in a jurisdiction in which a lot of what we've talked about has already been normalized in terms of access and opportunity. But it's still the case that in much of the country, this still is not where we are not yet where we need to be. And that is an environment in which kids can get the education they need so they can go out and start careers, to make enough money to provide for themselves and their family, whether it's in housing or, getting the healthcare they need to live long and prosperous lives, and to be able to do so in a just environment that doesn't take that away from them without for no particular reason. So I just want to close by thanking the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust for allowing me to participate. And I just want to leave one final thought with the audience. A 360-degree educational experience is one that will result in a just experience and environment for everybody. And everybody benefits in such an environment, and everybody loses when we don't have a 360-degree educational experience. Thank you all very much.
Statement from Dr. James.
Again, thank you all for this opportunity to participate in this wonderful panel discussion, so timely. And I think, again, I just really like to reiterate to those listening, inequality is not the status quo. Racism is not the status quo. And 69 years ago, with the passage of Brown versus Board of Ed, it was about trying to reach equality in the classroom. And there was a lot of pushback and a lot of, we're not going to have this, and a lot of misinformation and a lot of really turmoil. Fast forward to today, critical race theory, DEI, book banning. Again, I say, inequalities is not the status quo. Racism is not the status quo, and we must continue to make sure that it is not the status quo. Having these conversations does provide an opportunity for people to really hear about the true information and what we can do about moving forward. And in reference to psychological well-being, I would say that having these discussions about race and discrimination should be had with children from the beginning. When they start asking questions about race, when they start asking questions about a kid being a different color than they are, those conversations can be had age appropriately with kids. And that actually helps to diminish those issues around preconceived notions about who people are and what they stand for, and this concept of one group is more superior than the other. So I would just like to say, as I close, that as we think about moving and continuing to move toward equality, whether it's in education and whether it's in society in general, that remembering, again, this just was previously stated by Dr. Fontmore, that we all benefit. We all benefit. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind, and that we all benefit, and that we should start young with our children to make sure that they feel comfortable around differences, that they embrace differences, which will make a significant impact on them as an adult in the future. And I think I'll close there. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. James. We'll now hear from Representative Bowers.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews, and thank you, Pastor Chavis. I just want to say thank you again to the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust for hosting such an important discussion, and I was glad to join this conversation about the state of education and where it stands and where it might go. One thing I do want to say is that while some of these topics may have sounded like all doom and gloom, I ultimately am an optimist. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I do believe that brighter days are ahead, and that people like those on this panel or those of you tuning in tonight are working every day to improve our schools and our communities. We've covered several of today's flashpoints, and I know there will be ones in the future that we couldn't conceive of during this discussion right now. But at the end of the day, for everyone working for a brighter future in education, the important thing is that we keep getting up and getting back to it the next day. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Representative Bowers. We'll now hear from the board chair of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust, Dr. Benjamin Chavis. Dr. Chavis.
Thank you, Attorney Andrews. And again, thank to my fellow panelists. It's been a great discussion on behalf of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. This discussion is going so well. I'm going to make sure that we keep this up on our website, Brother Andrews, so people can review it over and over again. I think there's been some great, important points made. My closing remarks are simply this. A lucha continua. The struggle continues. Our struggle for freedom, our struggle for justice, our struggle for equality, our struggle for equity. We are a blessed people, not a cursed people. And all of what we've been through in the past and what we're going through even today should strengthen us, not make us become hopeless, or not make us want to, give up. I sense with tonight's panelists that the truth will set us free. We just have to make sure that the truth is taught, that the truth is understood, that the truth is embraced, that the truth is distributed using all the various technological media forms that are out there in channels today. And I believe that if we put that truth out there in the ears and the mind and the heart of our young people, they will not only respond and embrace, but they will take our struggle for freedom, justice, and equality and equity to the next level. That's why I'm optimistic. God bless each of our panelists. God bless the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. And thank you as we pledge to keep the legacy of Thurgood Marshall alive, the impact 69 years ago of Brown versus the Board of Education, and all of what has happened, and all what continues to need to be happening as we push forward for helping not only to make our communities have better quality of life, but all communities. This is about the oneness of humanity. We're all part of one human family, and we shouldn't allow these things, these negative, counterproductive, pseudo, anti-intellectual, ignorant theories divide us, but come together and stay together. So God bless. This has been a great forum. Thank you, Brother Andrews, for moderating. Thank you again to each of our panelists. Let's move forward, let's push forward, and let's win some more victories together.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chavis. On behalf of the board, the staff, the volunteers, and donors of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust, I want to thank all of our panelists, Dr. Fauntleroy and his 300-degree perspective, Dr. James about the benefit of age-friendly and age-appropriate conversations so that we all grow and learn into wisdom. Representative Bowers reminding us we got to keep getting up and we got to keep getting after it. And then Dr. Chavis reminding us about shunning, not to struggle, because we're not here to play, to dream, or to drift. We have hard work to do and heavy loads to lift. So we want to thank this panel, but most importantly, we want to thank those who took time tonight to join us in the audience. Because you came, we will, as Dr. Chavis said, put this program on our website, but it will give us the fuel we need to carry forward the conversation, because we all have more work to do to make sure the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education is a better definition of what humanity is and what humanity must remain. So want to God bless you, keep safe, healthy, and well, and we look forward to seeing you in future programs of the Thurgood Marshall Center Trust. Thank you and good evening.